What's going on YouTube? Want to come out with addressing weakness out of the bottom of the squat part 2. So essentially in this video I'm going to just reiterate on some things that I've tried to point out in addressing weakness out of the bottom of the squat previously in my other video. So if you haven't seen that one, check that one out first and then move on to this next one. But as far as I guess my opinions on getting strength or better force production out of the bottom, I would say there's certain exercise selections that I was mentioning earlier within the pause squats and the tempo. But essentially getting better at the bottom of the squat first is just addressing a lot of issues that we may be experiencing if you don't necessarily know what to look for at first. So instead of it being a strength issue, sometimes a lot of you are probably unfolding out of your squat or essentially can't even get out of the hole in the first place. One of the two things are really going to happen. You're either going to hit a wall, necessarily fail your squat as soon as you kind of raise out of the hole, and then it's just going to feel way too heavy, and then you just got to stop and then rack it. Or you're going to start to fight the squat. You're going to have the ability to fight the squat, but you're going to be straining, putting yourself in a extensive state, and then necessarily having that spine kind of get more along the lines of curving more than you would like to as you ascend, and then all you're essentially doing is unfolding, because more than likely your hips probably rise to a certain point, and so then you'll start the squat. Here's your hips, you'll start the squat, and then boom, your hips will rise, and then you'll unfold with the rest of your back. But essentially, if your hips aren't in line with your shoulders and your hips and shoulders aren't rising at the same rate, then you're not necessarily in the most efficient squat you could be utilizing. So at the end of the day, I want to encourage you guys to look at some of the videos of my squats. Even when you're watching me squat, I try not to break my core. I don't let my back do any of the work. I let all my legs do the work. So if you're taking into accord of how I'm trying to maximize my squat, I'm trying to show you guys I'm 6 foot 6'1". I'm a tall lifter. I got longer legs, so it's not easy. It's definitely not easy. And for all you people out there that are kind of like, oh, I'm a tall lifter, I'm just not meant to squat, it's too hard for tall guys, like, that's not the case. Obviously, develop your flexibility and mobility for the prerequisites before you really try to achieve optimal squat pattern. But essentially, if you have ankle restrictions, hip impingements, muscle fascia that's tight around the low back, upper back, if you have a tight, T-spine and necessarily everything up there is not loose, because essentially you do want your T-spine to be mobile, but you don't want your low back to be mobile. You want that to be very neutral, and neutral means it's just in a locked, safe position when you get that intra-abdominal pressure, when you take a big breath before your big deadlift or big squats. But essentially, most of you could probably, let me start off with that. Tip number one, you can probably take a bigger breath. You can honestly probably take a bigger breath. Something you might not always be thinking of is to take the breath, and then when you do take the breath and inhale that air, you want to kind of try to push it down to your stomach, essentially. Get it down in there and don't keep it in the chest, because when you keep it in the chest, it allows for more so the low back not to have enough pressure, and even though you feel like you're ready, you're still going to go down and unfold in the squat because there's not enough tension within your cores, like, from the hips to the top of you, to the bottom of your chest, essentially, and then enough pressure in there to get you through an efficient squat pattern or full range of motion without necessarily compensating in other areas like your lumbar erectors to finish the movement for you. Because essentially we don't want the good morning squat fault pattern, we want an optimal squat. And something I've been definitely looking into lately is how I move when I squat. Essentially, the squat is a movement pattern for me that proves a lot of my abilities to achieve certain positions. So I work on the Olympic lifts a lot, so essentially getting into the bottom position of a snatch or a clean is essential, and by me squatting and having that efficient form, optimal form, I can achieve that. So essentially getting a bigger breath, working on a weakness also outside of addressing weakness in the whole, essentially, I would say, of course the pause squats, of course the tempo squats, but outside of getting more intra-abdominal pressure with a bigger breath, I would say getting into that bottom position, learn how to utilize the stretch reflex and not descend too fast. Don't descend without control. So sometimes I like to tell my clients, descend to a halfway point and then utilize that stretch reflex at the bottom. So don't just full blown descend, but don't just full blown just, go slow all day long and then can try to control it. Try to necessarily control it to a degree until you reach that point where you've built that fine rhythm tuning of coordination between you and your squat pattern or your body and whatnot. And then finding that maximized stretch reflex position to when you get in your squat, you're controlling. You're controlling. Boom. And then back up. So essentially your quads are involved the whole time until you maximize that stretch reflex. And then when you do, you're immediately pushing back into your quads. And the big toe pressure is also another cue I say to a lot of my clients, because essentially they don't keep a flat footed pressure across their feet when they're squatting, and that's a huge issue. When I see your feet wobble, essentially you're not grounded enough. So at the end of the day, if there is so many takeaways, or if there is 3 takeaways, bigger breath, controlling your descent, and then maximizing the stretch reflex, and then 3, I guess a takeaway we can also take away is addressing weakness out of the hole. Maybe when it comes to your technique, I guess I'll go back to the tempo squats, because essentially if the weight is too heavy for you and you can't maintain that stiffness within your spine to keep it neutral in a position that allows you to transfer power or force production from your legs to the bar efficiently, and then maintain that neutral spine all the way up through your squat pattern, because essentially getting into any hyperextension movements is going to, over time, if not give you pain, essentially lead you to a failed heavy attempt in your competition. So you're kind of sitting there, you're doing this in practice. Understand, in your second or third attempt, you will fail it in your competition knee. And I'm not saying you, but if you don't fail it, then you literally probably are strained and fight so hard that you're like, okay, after that competition, I'm not coming back, because you necessarily put yourself in a strained position and have probably put yourself in an injury-prone training week or training weeks to come, if not injured after the meet. So, essentially with that being said, take the time to take tempo squats at lighter weights. So for the 3 tips today, addressing weakness out of the bottom of the squat, bigger breath, controlling the descent a little bit more until you maximize and find that rhythm and tuning with the coordination of maximizing that stretch reflex at the right time. And then 3, using lighter weights for tempo squats. Hope you liked the video. Tell me anything else you want to hear, share, or whatever, you know what I'm saying. Just let me know. I'm definitely knowledgeable on a lot of stuff. So ask me any questions you want to, comment, like, subscribe, share the video, and let me know if this was helpful.